This week on The Pieces, we have the former leader of the Labour Party, a lifelong campaigner, and somebody that believes that every person deserves a fair chance, and also someone that got me really engaged in politics about 10 years ago. This week, I'm super excited. We have Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, Jeremy Corbyn.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Grand, great.
Thank you so much. Like I said to you earlier before the cameras started rolling, I really got into politics because I hugely admired you and everything that you stood for. And back in when I was studying journalism, I was getting into a lot of cultural affairs, social issues, and I really believed in everything you stood for. So thank you for that.
Well, it's not stood, stand.
Stand for, exactly. Everything you stand for. That's true. There you go. But it's true. I think I was very disenfranchised with politics. Working class background, growing up, didn't really feel like I had access to that, It wasn't something that in school we were taught. So I was studying journalism and I was really angry at the media. And seeing someone like you really kind of brought life into what politics should be for me.
Well, politics should be fun and should be passionate and it should be inclusive. And it's not.
It's lacking
for the most part, it's not. My whole objective is to try and get people involved and recognise everybody's got something to contribute.
Absolutely. And I think the more voices, the better.
And it's mixing up art, creativity, music with economic ideas, with social ideas, and you just unleash such energy and such strength when you do that. But when politics is cynical, exclusive, cordoned off, closed off, you end up with nasty bits of legislation, quite a repressive state, and handing control over to the worst elements of our media.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, my dissertation was actually about media bias towards you, actually.
Really?
Yeah, towards you.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I'll check it out. It was over 10 years ago, but it was media bias.
Well, that'd be interesting, because I've just been sent a PhD done by a wonderful fella who did a PhD on the media treatment of me and my leadership of the Labour Party, and it's wonderful. I've been reading it all. It's great.
Well, I'll dig it out. I'll speak to my academics. I've got it. It will be somewhere. But I got 2-1 for it, so it wasn't too bad. But I really did a lot of research into it because it was a very time that I was very heavily involved in everything you stood for. You stand for.
Thank you. I'd love to read it.
I will do, and that we'll get into maybe that a bit later because it is a very annoying topic. But I want to start at the beginning of your story. So you were born in 1949 in Wiltshire. Mm-hmm. What sort of child was Jeremy Corbyn?
Fourth son. My dad worked at then it was called Westinghouse. It was engineering company, the Westinghouse Braking Signal Company. They made railway equipment, and we lived in a very, very small village near Chippenham in Wiltshire. And in many ways, it was an idyllic and beautiful childhood, because being the fourth child, your parents have seen it all, done it all, and they're quite relaxed, they're quite liberal. And it was a very small village. And I just remember, even at the age of 5 or 6, I'm sort of out on my own around the village, and people would say, 6 o'clock's time you went home. That sort of thing. It was that kind of ultra-safe environment. So it's beautiful, countryside, and I just grew up there. There was no such thing as nursery school or anything like that. So I was home till I was 5. And I just remember a lot of time as a very small child on my own in this village, in the garden, in the fields, and all that sort of thing. And so when I was told we had to go to school, I thought that was a really bad idea. I was quite happy as I was. I didn't sort of felt the need to do anything else, and then suddenly I'm stuck on a bus and sent to school every day. I thought that was a really bad idea, actually. I wasn't very keen on that at all. What would you have been?
No, I wasn't. I think school was a definite journey, a definite experience.
It was a quite strict Catholic primary school.
Okay.
I've no idea, still to this day, why my mum and dad sent me there. My mum was brought up Church of England, but was an atheist, but had a phenomenal knowledge of the Bible. My dad was sort of active in the Church of England, so I guess as a form of compromise, sent me to a Catholic school.
And you didn't like it there that much?
Well, it was all right in a way, because there was me and one other non-Catholic in our year in school, so we weren't allowed into the chapel, we weren't allowed into religious assemblies, so us two were just sent walking around the playing field. My memory of it was actually a lot of time doing absolutely nothing, because we weren't allowed in any of the religious bits of it.
So even though you weren't necessarily religious, they wouldn't allow you in?
No.
That's quite crazy, actually.
I thought it was weird.
Yeah.
I really did. And the nuns...
That's like segregation from like a...
Well, you wouldn't call it that then, but yeah, I mean, now it would be, wow, you know, ooh. I mean, I didn't understand what it was about anyway. Yeah. It didn't make any sense to me.
Your parents, Naomi and David, were both members of the Labour Party and peace campaigners. What was the household like growing up? Is that where you think you got
they'd met,
love?
Actually, in solidarity meetings with the Spanish Republic in the 1930s in Conway Hall in Red Lion Square. And my mum was then, or around that time, a student of psychology at King's College. My dad she was one of the very few, if only, women students at that time there. And my dad was an engineering apprentice at CAV in Acton, but he also did an engineering degree by evening class at what is now City University, and was very active in the union and very active in politics. He was a very driven person. They were both extremely hardworking and very well informed and very dedicated. My mum was, for example, active opposing the fascists in the 30s, was there at the Battle of Cable Street, selling a Daily Worker, Morning Star now, and they got together, and then the war came. Well, my dad had tried to enlist with the International Brigade for the Spanish Civil War, but he was asthmatic, so they wouldn't take him because they would only take people that were 100% fit. And so he couldn't go. So he spent a lot of time raising money and support. But I remember he was writing to people in Spain right through to the 60s who had been there opposing Franco in the 30s. They must have been quite old by then. And he kept in touch with them. We used to get Christmas cards and things from them in Spain, because that time Spain was under Franco. And then the war came, and his company was moved out of London to Chippenham in Wiltshire, with some sort of bizarre notion that in London it could be bombed, but if it was in Chippenham it couldn't be. So they were sent to Chippenham, where they lived, and then my three older brothers were born, and then eventually me in 1949. And so he worked in that place. My mum, she became she was a teacher, and then went full time back into work when I was a little bit older.
What would you say the core values around you growing up were?
Environmentally, we'd call it now. They didn't call it that then. They were very keen on nature, outdoor life, and so on. And I remember my dad always complaining about the way in which the Ministry of Agriculture subsidised farmers to destroy hedges. And he said they don't know what they're doing. They're destroying the very life we live on. They're taking away the opportunity for bird life and insect life. You know, he was very environmental, and they were also very interested in history and archaeology. So they used to drag me off to various digs of Roman villas. So they were very keen on history of the place and of the area, and they knew it extremely well. And so we were brought up with those kind of values, but also the values of inclusivity. Mm-hmm. One of our neighbours had been Italian prisoners of war. The man in the family, well, his wife came from Italy later. He had been sent and billeted to work on various farms locally. And at the end of the war, he didn't feel like going back to Italy. And so he got a job on a farm nearby, and they were our next door neighbours. And so it was lovely talking to them and growing up with their children as well. So it was lovely, a lovely area and lovely childhood. And then we moved from there to the Midlands when I was about 7, because my dad decided to leave the company he was with. I never really knew why, but mind you, at 7 years old, you don't understand these things, don't ask. And it turned out, because one of his friends wrote to me years later and said, I used to work with your dad. You know why he moved? I didn't. He said, well, they'd got him down as politically suspicious because of his activities in the 1930s, 1940s, union activity. He was actually a member of the Labour Party, but in the 30s had been probably quite sympathetic to the Communist Party. He gave me a copy of his version of his edition of Capital by Marx, and all his annotations in it are fascinating. He wrote lots on it. And so we moved to Shropshire or later, but he moved first. So he was away for about 3 years. When I was a very small child, he'd come home at weekends. So he'd come on a Friday night and go back on a Sunday night. So that must have been hard for him. But he worked very hard and he wanted to do the best for us. He was a lovely man. Great admiration for him.
Well, I think it's really interesting and beautiful that you were quite engaged with politics because it was around you a lot. But you got into it quite young.
Yeah, I got involved more and more, partly by an obsessive following of news and current affairs by me. I was academically not particularly successful at anything in school except literature, history and geography. Those are the things that kind of interested me. I was put in a grammar school later on, and they had, how should I put it, quite backward ideas. So we had an art class, and they didn't fancy my ideas on abstract art. As far as they were concerned, art was the perfect form. Wow. So I was asked to leave the art class and told I wasn't good enough to do art. I'd have to go and do woodwork. They really looked down on craft. I said, that's absolutely fine by me. I'm very happy. And woodwork was taught by a local carpenter who wasn't qualified to do anything except what he did. He was great. So it was a win all round. I still enjoy doing woodwork.
Do you know, it's so funny because I got told the same thing in art.
What, you were no good?
I was no good because I wasn't amazing at drawing basically a vase, like to how it had to be. And like that, it made a...
Yeah, they said to me, you've got exactly the same thing. I said, why?
Yeah.
I said, don't argue, just draw it. I said, why?
They actually said to me you weren't creative. I was not creative because I couldn't do it. And it stayed in my mind for a while, like, because it does. If you were told that in, like, I can't remember how old I was, 8 years old.
I had a better one with music. Oh, it was great. So first day of the music lesson, the teacher was, well, he was a weird guy, but he was quite funny, actually, in a way. So he lined up the whole class around the wall in alphabetical order. First day in school. He goes, call out your name, go, He gets to me, and I gave my name, and he said, have you got any brothers? I said, yes, sir, I've got 3. They all came to this school. He said, precisely. They were all useless and tone deaf. Get out.
That's horrible to have that,
like a sort of hereditary musical inability.
Yeah.
Wow.
At school, I feel like people do so many things that they're not great at instead of being pushed towards things that they could excel at, you know?
Do you know what? And of that class, I don't know, I haven't kept in touch with any of them. I'm probably the only one who still listens to classical music.
Yeah.
It kind of makes you feel a bit rubbish about yourself.
That's what that style of education was designed to do. My whole philosophy is that there's something in everybody that you need to get out. You talk to children in school about what their hopes and fears and so on are. It's fascinating. And then I do quite a lot of work with a poetry book we've produced and go around the place and ask people about the school kids, say, how many of you write poetry? If you're in a primary school with 7-year-olds, every hand goes up. Yeah. 10 years old, about half of them. 13 years old, they will stare at the floor. And then eventually they point to some poor kid on the fire. She does. Ooh. And then eventually conversation gets going, and quite a lot of them are interested in it. So I found this absolutely fascinatingness of going around the country doing these events with our poetry book, Poetry for the Many. And it just brings a very interesting combination of people in, and young people as well, who come. And we're in Liverpool, and we're doing this event at the Casa. And these kids are in the middle, sort of looking a bit sort of... So I said, are you guys okay? Yeah, Jazz. I've got a poem, can I read it? Then they pulled out their mobile phones, read the poems. Great.
Where do you think that philosophy comes from for you? That everyone should have access, or everyone has something that they should be?
Well, it's obvious, isn't it?
I think so. I don't think most people do. I feel like...
It's obvious. If you go into an over-competitive, over-meritocratic society,
Yeah.
then you end up with obsessive streaming in education, obsessive testing with education. You end up wasting and losing the talents of so many. And you end up with some people being angry. I mean, we shouldn't bring up teenagers being angry at underachievement. We should bring up teenagers to feel they have an opportunity to make their contribution, and we're going to listen to them. Now, it's not easy. I get all that. I mean, I represent an area that is difficult with it, but you have to look at what everybody can contribute to our community.
I guess the intersections of race, wealth, class, like all of that come into play with it. And I think a lot of the time, especially now, I think there's a massive
disengagement of politics from the younger generation.
Yes, there's also much less social interaction. I mean, I look at the joy I had of growing up in a very small, very supportive, secure community with no boundaries. And I look now at the way my own kids grew up, but also the way children in my own constituency are growing up, where there is concerns about their safety, and they don't go out very much, and a lot of their interaction in life is on a computer screen or a phone screen. Good to a point. Technology is there, but also where's the social skills come from with that?
It's scary. I feel like my youngest sibling is a victim of that. And I actually read 47% of Gen Zs believe that we should have a dictatorship, or a very high amount, and then half of them believe that women's rights have gone too far. Like, it was a shocking thing to read. Like, it surprised me that it was a Gen Z that said this. It was a Channel 4 study, 3,000 people, so it's not hugely representative, but worrying statistics. And it's the rise of people, figureheads, I guess, I'll say the name, like Andrew Tate, and people that are spurting this kind of real misogyny towards women, which is worrying.
Yes.
Politically, in the media, there's so much that's trying to segregate us and divide us, to keep us all apart. And it worries me. It's getting worse and worse, I fear.
Yeah, I think the endless attack on rights, the development of opportunities, the development of expression, the challenge of the way history and geography were taught in schools, I think is wholly good. But there certainly is a reversal going the other way, in that we're going back to some very, in my view, very conservative, very backward philosophies. And I mean, as you say, I hadn't seen this survey, but the idea that women's rights have gone too far, what on earth do they mean by that? Well, I think I can guess what goes behind it, but it's very disappointing and very depressing.
It's really sad, and I feel like something that really engaged me with your politics was everything you stand for, and I think it was all about equality. It's like the premise, like the core value, equal for everyone. Islington North, you've been at Islington North MP for 40 years. How do you keep those people mobilised, you know? Like, they support you, and even when the media can be shitty, how do you do that?
I'm forever grateful to the people of Islington North for their patience, love and tolerance. They really are amazing. I was first elected in '83, and I was very much of the left of the Labour Party, and put in my first election address about nuclear weapons and environment and peace issues and public ownership of utilities and so on, all of that. I also was determined from the very beginning that I would be as fully engaged with the community as I possibly could be. And so I opened a local office, which was unusual in those days for an MP to have a local office. And I would just do a lot of door knocking, go to community events and community social events and schools and churches, mosques and everything else, and just keep involved with the community. And I've done that all the time. And when we had the election last July, And I stood as an independent, announced that when the election came around that I was going to run as an independent. It was a big leap. I'd been a Labour candidate on all the previous general elections, as well as I'd been a councillor before in Haringey. And it's a jump into the unknown. We had hundreds and hundreds of people came to help in the election. Many local people came and helped to knock on doors and deliver leaflets and so on, who had never done anything politically before, even for the Labour Party. And they came and helped, and we didn't compromise on the message. I put on my election leaflet, refugees are welcome here. It wasn't what the Labour Party was saying, it wasn't what Starmer was saying, it wasn't what anybody else was saying, and that's an example. And we won with just slightly shy of 50% of the vote, which in the circumstances was, I think, a very, very good result. And I'm forever grateful to all those people that came out and worked, and the local people for their support. I mean, they'd been through years and years of media saying what a fundamentally evil person I was. I mean, I don't personally think I'm evil, and I'm not going to confess to being evil because I don't think I am. But there are some media that think that.
That's kind of what I meant when I said the outside of, like, because your beliefs and your views, I don't think are, but the media would portray that because it's not part of their narrative. But you, when you were Labour leader, you had a lot of support.
Yeah, indeed.
You had a lot more support than Starmer.
Well, look at the total vote that Labour achieved, particularly in the 2017 election. It's the highest vote this century for the Labour Party. And there's only 2 elections ever that Labour's got more votes than we got on that occasion. So we started that campaign on 24% in the polls. We had 91% of media coverage was hostile. And I remember the day the election was announced, there was sort of consternation ran through Parliament. Wow, May's done it. We're having an election, and this is Labour MPs, we're going to get totally done in. A number of them came rushing into my office and said, you've got to resign immediately, we'll elect somebody else. So I offered them a cup of tea. Always offer a tea. You've got to be nice to people. And then I just called the office together. They were all a bit shocked because nobody really expected the election to come. I said, okay, look out the window. Why? I said, just look out the window, please. And they did. I said, what do you see out there? They said, well, people, this election is about them. It's about what we do for everybody else. It's not about us. It's not about our individual egos. It's about what we do and what we achieve. And so we went out with a philosophy that we would spend as much time as possible all around the country, not necessarily in London. And I did 100 events around the country in the election campaign, rallies all over the place. And each one got bigger than the last, and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I've got these complete miserable naysayers who were employed by the Labour Party to analyse elections. When I ever went into the head office, they'd say, I say, okay, so what's it looking like? Oh, it's terrible. We're going to get thumped. We're losing. We've got to have a defensive strategy. Your strategy is completely wrong. It's not working. Da, 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 da. I said, have you been out of the office in the past 3 weeks? He said, no, we know what's going on. I said, I'm not sure you do. I said, you want to get out a bit more. So anyway, I got really annoyed with these people. So I went back out on the road again. And we got the result we did. Now, just think if the media had been just ever so slightly less hostile, and the entirety of the Labour Party machine had been working for a Labour victory, what could have been achieved? We got the votes there. So I think, there needs to be a bit of a reckoning on all of that you can mobilise people on what was actually a radical programme, but only radical in the context of what Thatcher and the Tories had done to our society. Yeah. The creation of the sharp-elbowed individual as being the hero of our lives. Well, it's not quite like that. So I was very proud of what we did in that election, but obviously sad that we didn't quite get it over the line. We learned a lot from that campaign, and a lot of people became enthused and very active in politics. Okay, we're now 9 years on, 10 years on almost from my leadership. I keep finding lots of people all over the country who are super active, housing campaigns, jobs campaigns, environment campaigns. And I said, well, what brought this on? They said, well, you gave us a chance.
I believe that that's true, and you should feel proud about everything you did, because I think it felt like the first time I saw somebody that resonated with the values of the people.
The weird thing was living it, because the house was under siege from the media 24/7. You got these right-wing journalists hanging around outside the house just shouting abusive questions at me or my wife. They'd have shouted at the cat if he'd come out. Poor El Gato, who's passed on recently, I'm sorry to say. But there was the abuse that we received the whole time. So it was kind of weird living in a siege at home, going into Parliament, which wasn't the easiest place to be by any manner of means, and then going out on the road where the whole thing was completely different.
How do you feel about that hostility?
Well, it was like being in the middle of sort of a complicated movie where you're not quite sure what the end is going to be. And so I felt always determined that we would get a message out of the kind of society we wanted to live in. And so it's not just about balance sheet economics. It's not just about numbers and everything. It's about whether you have an inclusive society, whether you believe in people, and whether you want to develop an education system that gives the opportunities. And so I inserted into our manifesto a very clear commitment that we would have a pupil arts premium, which would mean that every school, wherever it was in the whole of the country, got sufficient money for every child to learn a musical instrument, art, and theatre and all those things. That brings out the best in people. And so I thought we got some very interesting policy proposals going there. And it was all about empowering people, empowering workers in work, and obviously issues of peace and justice worldwide. Now, that was the real issue, if you think about it.
Yeah.
The real issue wasn't our economic policy. I mean, I remember talking to CBI and others about this. They didn't like it. They didn't really agree with it. But most of it, they said they could live with. They weren't very happy about workers on boards. They weren't very happy about workers' empowerment. But they recognised that it was a seriously thought-out proposal. And then, you'll remember this, the Manchester bomb was the most awful, appalling thing possible. And I remember I was in Doncaster at the time when it happened. I was travelling from Hull, and we stopped in Doncaster and we heard what happened. So we stayed in Doncaster and followed the events, and then it was horrific. So I went to Manchester the next day, and they had a kind of commemoration in Albert Square, which I went to. And then campaigning was suspended by all parties by agreement. And then I had several phone meetings with Theresa May and other party leaders that became increasingly tetchy, because it was quite clear to me that she just wanted to suspend campaigning as long as possible, because she could read the entrails and she knew what was going on. And so I just said, well, actually, we're restarting campaigning. Whatever you say, we've had our break. But I said, and then I was going to make a speech, which I did, about what I thought the causes of terrorism were and how it was linked to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. And I did this on the Friday morning. A very large number of people, even people in my team and a lot of people that were actually quite supportive, said, don't do it. Don't do it. It's going to wreck everything. Do not say what you're going to say, because they'd seen the outline of what my speech was going to be. And I said, no, it's got to be said. It's got to be said that if we go around the world getting involved in wars, people end up doing the most abominable and appalling and horrific things. We are the creators of the problem. And so I made the speech, and because we wanted it to get the best impact we could, I did something I don't normally do, refused to take any questions. Just, that's it. That's my statement. End. And left the room. Then the avalanche from the media happened within minutes. Every radio program, etc. Wow. And then, interestingly, and I didn't know they were going to do it, YouGov did a phone poll 2 hours, 3 hours later. What do you think of the speech that Mr. Corbyn made? 61% said he's on the right lines. And after that, everybody shut up. Because what we'd done is challenged the media and military consensus in every way. I thought what happened in Manchester was abominable, appalling, obviously. Young people at a music venue should not be treated like that. That shouldn't happen to anybody. But I thought it was absolutely the right thing to do.
You have been a campaigner for peace, and now especially you're being very vocal with what's happening in Gaza, and rightly so. I believe like the way that's being kind of politicised is pretty abhorrent. But where do you think we need to go?
Well, it challenges a whole lot of things about our society, our foreign policy, and our arms sales policy. And we've just produced a book called The Monstrous Anger of the Guns through the Peace and Justice Project, which is an analysis of the world's arms trade, 24 trillion a year going in arms. And almost half of all arms expenditure is done by the USA. The power of lobbying of the arms industry actually influences foreign policy in many, many ways. And they are there promoting wars and promoting conflict rather than promoting peace. And so I've done a lot of meetings with this book all around the country, and very interesting numbers of people come for discussion, including those who work in the arms industry. They're not the enemies. They've got a job, and they're very skilled people. I just wish they weren't making those weapons. They're doing something else, something more socially beneficial, shall we say. Where do we go from here? I think we have to keep on demanding an end to the sale of arms to Israel. We have to keep on demanding the withdrawal of Israeli forces in their entirety from Gaza and the West Bank, and an end to the settlement policy, and recognise that what's happened, 47,000 bodies have now been counted in Gaza, and that number's going to go up as the rubble is cleared. And the mental health scars are going to be intergenerational. Just imagine if you or I had lived in Gaza and all of our families had been killed except us two, we'd have survivor's guilt. I think, why me? Why did my brothers, my aunt, my uncle, my dad, my mum, everybody die, not me? And so the mental health scars are absolutely huge in Gaza and increasingly in the West Bank. And so there has to be a continuation of this. And so instead of attacking people who oppose this war, let's recognise that actually opinion around the world is pretty huge majority think that Israel's bombardment is wrong, and the countries that supplied the weapons.
The UK is one of them as well.
We've been supplying the bombs that we can't stand back and say this is shocking when we were sending the bombs that were used to bomb hospitals and schools.
I remember being at a protest for when Syria war was happening, and we sent the fighter jets over, and I remember being at a protest for that. And I just think like getting involved in war is just devastating. It's never going to end good.
You look at Afghanistan. The West went into Afghanistan in 2001 in the belief that by going in there, catching Osama bin Laden, all would be well. They didn't catch Osama bin Laden for a very long time. It wasn't in Afghanistan anyway. It was in Pakistan. Maybe he'd gone to Afghanistan, I don't know. And then more and more troops went in, the war developed, the Taliban grew, etc., etc. Thousands of people died, hundreds of British soldiers died in Helmand province and elsewhere, and American soldiers, and all that money went in. Then eventually they negotiate with the Taliban for a withdrawal, and we now have a very poor country with an appalling human rights record. And I was in Calais last year talking to people that were living in rough camps in Calais and trying to get on a boat to come here. And there were people who'd worked for the British Army in Afghanistan. And those that spoke much English said to me things like, well, most of those did because they'd worked for the British Army. They said, how is it your country had so much money to come to Afghanistan with all that military equipment, and we've got nothing? We're starving, we've got no medical aid, and these are people that had managed to get by various means from Afghanistan to France in order to try and get here. Those are victims of war, which we were part of.
I think we prioritise money into nuclear weapons, war, military, over people.
All this money is going on the Trident replacement. Well, would any rational person ever use a nuclear weapon? Because you know full well it's the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. It cannot be targeted in any way. A nuclear weapon will obviously kill a very large number of people, create a nuclear winter, destroy so much of the world, and anybody uses a retaliatory one, even worse. So I was constantly pressurized on all this because I'd said, well, I wouldn't use a nuclear weapon. I just wouldn't do it. End of.
And then that was used against you. I remember.
Well, he was said, what kind of man are you? I said, well, it's up to you to judge, but I've got this sort of old-fashioned, rather arcane view that human life should be preserved. There was a young woman at, when we did the Newsnight programme in the 2017 election, it was in York, and all these guys were going on at me, and David Dimbleby going on at me, come on, use the nuclear weapon, going, what kind of man are you? You'll leave the country to fences and so on. And then Dimbleby says to me, you got anything more to say? I said, I think everything that needs to be said's been said. Let's move on. So he said, okay. So he points to this young woman in the audience who wasn't expecting to be called, you're next. So she said, I came here for a political discussion, and all I find is I'm in a room full of a lot of madmen who want to go to war.
Yeah.
She was brilliant. She just said it all in one line.
Yeah.
I didn't get to talk to her after. I wished I had, because I thought she was just absolutely brilliant, just one line.
Yeah, it's wild. I always found that crazy.
Let's be strong. Yeah. Let's argue for peace.
Yeah, exactly.
And let's meet our perceived enemies and see where we get. You're not going to get peace unless you talk to those that have a different point of view.
Do you think
The pendulum swung the other way now.
Well, it has and it hasn't. We're in strange times, that's for sure. Yes, there's a rise of the far right all across Europe and a rise of the far right in this country. There is a sort of a swing of the pendulum on what one would call small L liberal social policies as well as economic policies. But then there's another side to it. Last weekend in Germany, Berlin, thousands and thousands of young people go out on the streets to demonstrate against the AfD. The far right thought they were going to win the National Assembly elections in France. The Communist Party, Mélenchon and the left parties all got their act together in 3 days, because it was a very short time span for elections in France, far too short actually, but that's it. And they won the election. Well, that shows that there is an innate and determined group of people who are not prepared to go down the road of racism, not prepared to denigrate refugees and asylum seekers, and don't want to go to war and actually want peace. I want to see peace between Russia and Ukraine. I want to see, and yesterday, for the first time for a long time in Parliament, there was actually a serious discussion about the wars in Sudan and the DRC. The death rate in the Sudan is unbelievable. Coming from what? Supply of arms by the UAE, supply of arms by others, and what's at the heart of it? The minerals of Sudan. What's at the heart of the war in the Congo? The stuff we put in our mobile phones.
It's sad, it's scary, it's sad to think. When it comes to politics now, what are your thoughts on a very rich person publicly backing certain parties?
I find it quite scary that somebody with apparently enormous amounts of wealth, but you know what? I'd like to analyse that wealth. I just remember when I was on the Security Committee investigating pensions, we investigated the Mirror Group Pension Fund and Robert Maxwell. Very interesting. Maxwell, who had always presented himself as a super rich oligarchic tycoon, actually didn't have any money at all. It was all candy floss. Bernie Madoff and others the same. So you just wonder, all this apparent wealth of this person we're talking of, how much of that is inflated share values of companies? How much of that is almost pyramid stuff? And so I think we should just be a bit cautious. But you're quite right. The central point of your question is a very good one. Is it right that somebody with so much wealth can actually try to dominate politics by saying, well, I'm going to bankroll this party, I'm going to bankroll the AfD, and then start sending instructions around the world about who should be leader of this party, that party, or the other? Well, we're in quite dangerous anti-democratic times.
Yeah. And getting involved in not just politics in the US, but politics in the UK.
Yeah.
Publicly backing kind of parties like the Reform Party. I think it's really scary. It's a really worrying time.
Although I noticed Farage looking a bit miserable last week because he'd been told he'd got to move on. He needed a new leader.
Yeah.
They sit in front of I sit with our independent MPs in the back row in Parliament, and Farage and his mates are in front of us. So you kind of overhear bits and pieces of their conversations. They were all a bit miserable last week. I felt almost sorry for them, but I held back.
Jeremy Corbyn, what do you hope that your legacy is going to be?
I'm not dead.
But what do you hope it's going to be?
Oh, God, okay. All right, since you ask. I've been very lucky in life, and I still am, that I've been able to spend my life working with and for others and representing my community and trying to give voice to people that otherwise not be heard, voice to the voiceless, and be able to argue for a different world, an environmentally sustainable world, a more peaceful world. A lot of things we haven't achieved, but a lot of things we have. Attitudes have changed, people have been empowered, and so I hope that all of the work that I and many, many others do, it's not about me, it's about others, gives hope to others. So let's leave hope behind.
Thank you, Jeremy Corbyn, for coming on The Pieces.
I loved it, and thank you for everything that you do.
My pleasure, thank you very much. And do you know what? I'm going to carry on doing it.
It's good.